Hello. We are moving on in our nutrition section to talk today about the psychology of eating. So this is on our thoughts, feelings, and behaviors around food, why we eat, how we eat, what we eat, rather than just on the food stuff itself. And like I said in the last video, this is just as important, if not more so, in terms of nutrition and health and learning to eat better. And a lot of times we just focus on the what of food, like what should I be eating? But when we skip over these pieces, it's hard for many of us to actually determine why we're eating what we do and then to change what we eat. So, topics of the day. Why is it hard to eat well, even when we know what we should eat? We'll talk about things like mindless eating, our eating environments, and the research around dieting, and then we'll talk about mindful eating as a strategy to cope with some of these challenges. So, why is it hard to eat well? You can pause the tape here and think about this question for a minute yourself, and I'll go through a couple different reasons. Like you've probably heard me mention before, in addition to teaching this health class, I run and teach in our personal training program, and I own and operate my own health coaching business, which focuses a lot on this question. Why is it hard to eat well? And then helping individuals navigate it. So let's walk through some of the pictures here. 1, our eating environment makes it challenging. We have endless options for very vast quantities of calories in food everywhere we go that are pretty cheap, often cheaper than healthier options. We have, if we're moving one picture over, we often have a lack of time to eat because we have busy schedules here in the United States and in many countries, and we very much value productivity. So it can sometimes feel to many of us that sitting down to just pay attention to our food and to take time just to eat can be frivolous. So we eat while we're on the go. Moving to bottom left, we often eat when we are distracted. Kind of going with the point before, we have so many things that can distract us these days, both work-related things or school-related things, and just general entertainment things, like our cell phones or TVs or Netflix or computers, where really we have so much endless information at the touch of a button. We see increased portion sizes in restaurants, supermarkets, stores, fast food places, etc., gradually increasing decade by decade, so that if you are to go to a store now or a restaurant and order a meal, it will be much higher in calories and energy than if you were to order that same entree 20 or 30 years ago. And then lastly, I have this little punny picture here. Stress is dessert spelled backwards. And I think this is so important because this is the biggest thing I see. And this is the biggest thing I hear as to why it's hard for people to improve their eating habits. Again, people generally know what to do. They generally can come up with some kind of plan, but it's the emotions and stress and life circumstances that get in the way. And many of us find that food is comforting and can be used as a coping mechanism when we're feeling overwhelmed. And so if you resonate with that or with any of these, but the stress one in particular, before we even start talking about this, I want to ask that you have some compassion for yourself, because this is a challenging thing that many of us deal with. It's a very normal human response, and beating yourself up over it actually won't help any. I don't know if you all can hear the fireworks going on in the background. It's not the 4th of July. I don't know why there are fireworks going on outside. Nevertheless, so what is mindless eating? I said that's one of the issues with how we eat as a country. Mindless eating. So this is eating without paying attention to our food. So you're mindlessly munching. You're eating without focusing on the actual experience. You might be texting or emailing or surfing the internet or watching Netflix or driving or doing homework, right? There are numerous things we can be doing while eating, especially because so many of our foods are convenience foods. So why do we do this? Well, it's pretty simple. We are busy people. You might go to school and work and raise children and have friends and partners and other activities that you like to do. And eating 3 or plus times a day can take time away from that. So we try to crunch these things in together. We have little time to just stop and eat. As a country, we generally have what are called utilitarian values, meaning that we value what's good for everybody, and we value productivity and outcome. So if getting things done is good and useful, wasting time is bad and useless for many of us. And that can include what might feel like wasting time to sit down and eat. We have what are often called weapons of mass distraction, things we talked about before, like cell phones and computers that can endlessly distract us throughout the day. My phone just popped up a little bit ago and told me that I've been looking at it or engaging with it for 2 hours and 20 minutes today. And that's really a lot of hours every day. And we can use it for a variety of things. We can text, we can email, we can read news stories, we can listen to music, podcasts, etc. But that constant pull for our attention can distract us from other things. We often eat for reasons other than hunger, like I said before. So stress, sadness, loneliness, overwhelm can prompt many of us to eat. Some of you might not resonate with this. Some people, in fact, eat less when they're feeling stressed. Some, on the other hand, eat more. And so a constantly busy, stressed out life can lead us to over-consuming food over time. And then we also have processed foods in the environment that encourage overconsumption. And we'll go over that in a minute. So what are some of the consequences of this type of eating? Well, unsurprisingly, we eat too fast, right? If we're not paying attention, we can just shovel food into our mouths and move right along. And this eating too fast leads to overconsumption. So there's tons of research showing that if you don't pay attention to the food while you're eating it, you ultimately end up eating more and needing more food to feel full and satisfied. So there's something called the cephalic phase digestive response. Cephalic means head, digestive response you can figure out. And this just is the part of your digestive response that happens in your brain. And it's about 20 to 30% of your whole eating experience. So while you're eating and you're viewing your food and you're smelling your food and you're seeing your food and tasting your food and hearing your food sometimes, you are actually releasing neurotransmitters and chemicals and hormones in the brain that are telling you that you're full. However, if you don't pay attention to the food or to the experience of eating, you miss this portion of it. And so it requires more food for you to hit that sensory threshold. When we engage in mindless eating, we often make poor nutrition choices. So we just choose to eat whatever is convenient, easy, because we want to move quickly, and we don't take the time to think about what foods might feel nourishing to both our taste buds and our bodies. We have less satisfaction in the food we're eating and less satiety, which is another word for fullness. We don't feel full as easily. We miss our hunger and fullness cues, meaning we dysregulate from our natural body cues that tell us when and how much to eat. So if you think of a baby, for example, babies cry when they're hungry, and then when fed, they will actually stop eating when they're full. And you might know they're full because they'll start throwing food around rather than putting it in their mouth, or they'll cry to get up, or they'll generally be disengaged and want to do something else. So these little infants who don't even know how to walk or talk know how to regulate how much food they need. And research actually shows that if you continue to allow children to do this, that they will be able to regulate their food intake over time. It's when we step in and try to control it for them that we start to get distanced from these signals. So when we mindlessly eat, we often miss the signals that say we're hungry or full. Eventually, this will likely lead to weight gain and or the development of chronic diseases that are related to excess food or excess weight. So I imagine many of you can probably resonate this. It's very common in our society. Even though I try to practice the opposite of this, which is mindful eating that we'll define later, and I teach nutrition and exercise science and health, it's still very hard for me to do. It's still not something that I do all the time, but it is something that I aspire to. So we'll get into that. Another reason why it's potentially harmful to eat mindlessly is that when we eat in a frenzied, stressed, or disengaged manner, we are triggering our sympathetic nervous system. And we talked about these two nervous systems earlier in our section on stress. So as a brief reminder, the sympathetic nervous system is our fight or flight nervous system, and this sends blood to our muscles to fight, flee, or freeze and hide. It takes blood away from our digestive system, meaning that we don't digest our food as well. When the parasympathetic nervous system is engaged, this is our rest or digest, it's called such for a reason because blood flow increases to our central organs and our gut activity increases. We break down, digest, and assimilate more food. And this also decreases things like stomach pain, gas, bloating, acid reflux, irritable bowel syndrome, etc., because our digestive system is working. So I know many of you have probably experienced times when you're very stressed, and in addition to either eating less or eating more, you might find that when you do eat, you get a tummy ache, or you get constipation or diarrhea, or you get gas or bloating or heartburn, right? So all of those things are symptoms that your digestive system just isn't working as hard as you might want it to be when you eat. So moving on from mindless eating, another issue that we mentioned is our eating environment, where we have lots of high-calorie food, so calorically dense, nutrient sparse, that are convenient, easy, and relatively cheap. So this is a hard one to overcome. For many of you who are working college students, getting cost-effective food is quite important, and getting as much food as you can for that cost is quite important. And so fast food options can often be cheaper, right? They have the dollar menu at McDonald's, and lots of things are available for $1. So I can see why, or you can see why this would be advantageous or beneficial. However, like I said, these foods offer an abundance of calories, but very little micronutrients, the vitamins and minerals that we need to function well and to break down our food and turn it into energy efficiently. So the environment has an impact, and this is just a recent study from the journal Cell Metabolism in 2019 that digs into this. So they put two groups of people on two different diets for 2 weeks each, and then they reversed it. So one of the diets was an ultra-processed diet. So they had like a lot of white, processed, refined grains and foods high in trans fat, things you would think of like Cheetos and chips and processed cured meats. And then they fed them an unprocessed diet of fruits, vegetables, whole grains, lean meats, dairy, etc. And on both diets, they were offered the same amount of calories every day and allowed to eat as much as they wanted. So offered the same amount of calories. One was just whole foods calories. One was packaged processed foods calories. And then they said, eat up. And this was a really cool study because it was a metabolic ward study, meaning that they kept all of these individuals living in the environment and controlling and measuring exactly how much food they ate, rather than common nutrition studies where people go home and just report back on what foods they ate. This is highly unreliable method of studying nutrition, but it's how much nutrition research is done because it's sort of what's easiest and makes sense. But nonetheless, this one was cool because it kept people there and controlled for exactly and measured exactly what they ate. So after 2 weeks on one diet, they switched. So maybe they started with the ultra-processed and then they went to the unprocessed, or vice versa. And what did they find? Well, they found that on the ultra-processed diet, people ate an average of 500 additional calories every single day. 500 extra calories every single day, which would add up to about an extra pound of weight gain every week, which if you keep doing the math, adds up to about 50 pounds, give or take, in a year. So you can see that the types of foods we eat, these packaged processed foods that are so abundant in our environment, do matter. They do have an impact. And then people's weight changed as we would expect. So when they were on the ultra processed diet in 2 weeks, they gained about a little over 2 pounds. This is in kilograms, so 1 kilogram is 2.2 pounds. And when they were on the unprocessed diet, they lost a little over 2 pounds, exactly as would be reflected by the additional calories they ate. So that's fascinating, and just tells you that it's not just the quantity of food that you eat. Well, this did change the quantity, but the quality has an impact on the quantity. So if your goal is potentially to lose or to maintain your weight, and you're eating a lot of packaged and processed foods, it will potentially make it harder for you to do that. And one of the reasons that they suggested that people might have eaten more packaged and processed foods on this diet is because these foods generally have less protein in them. Protein is one of our most filling and satiating macronutrients. And they suggested that maybe humans have this innate level of protein that they need to get in a day, and they'll keep eating until they hit it. So that's one suggestion, that getting enough protein in each meal is a really good idea. And then also what we find in a lot of these packaged and processed foods is this idea of vanishing caloric density. So vanishing caloric density, you can think of foods like ice cream or Cheeto Puffs or something along those lines. These foods that literally melt in your mouth. And part of that cephalic phase digestion response involves your brain literally sensing the density of food in your mouth. And when it senses this food, it says, okay, I've eaten. But if the food is melting in your mouth as you chew it, your brain isn't sensing as many calories or as much food is actually there. So you're able to eat more food and more calories because it kind of sneaks by your brain. So again, a lot of these really kind of melt in your mouth packaged processed foods make it easier to overconsume. So this kind of goes hand in hand. The eating environment and the mindless eating are really tied together. Often each one promotes and fuels the other. And I just want to be clear that I'm not saying that it's never appropriate to have packaged or processed foods. It certainly can be. It certainly is for many people. And there are a lot of things that go into it. Like when we talked about what is eating well in the last lesson, there are cultural contexts, there are environmental contexts, there are financial contexts that all go into what eating well means, right? So if you're a really busy student and you work on the side and you don't have a lot of time to prepare your meals, does that mean you should never eat a granola bar or a bag of crackers? Of course not, right? It just means that balancing that out with other ways to get more nutrient dense foods in also that are cost effective is a really good idea. And just as a sidebar, because I don't know if I have this included anywhere else, some more cost-effective ways to get nutrient-dense foods in would be considering things like fruits and vegetables. They're generally pretty cheap, and if you even wanted to make them cheaper and or last longer, you can buy them frozen. And frozen fruits and vegetables typically retain all of their nutrient value and sometimes more because they're kind of frozen with the nutrients inside and they're not degrading as they get transported to the stores. So frozen is going to be a great idea and much better than canned. So fresh and frozen are your ways to go. However, if you wanted to include more protein sources, like cheap protein sources in your diet, you can find canned chicken, canned tuna, canned salmon, etc. And those options are going to be cheaper than buying like a salmon fillet or some chicken breasts. So those are cheaper, more cost-effective options for getting nutritious foods. You might also try checking out they're like what are called ethnic grocery stores. So like 99 Ranch Market is one that's close to Mesa, and they often have a bunch of unique foods, but also more cost-effective options. Cool. So the last thing we'll talk about is dieting. And many people who want to lose weight diet. It's sort of a natural in our current culture, a natural cause and effect one follows the other, right? If we're feeling uncomfortable with our weight, we're told to or we think to diet in its myriad forms. And that can be literally following a diet like Atkins or South Beach or keto or whatever the diet of the day is. Or that can just be like slashing your calories or following something like Weight Watchers or Nutrisystem that actually gives you specific diet foods to eat. But before we just accept that as the thing to do, let's look at some research around it. So there was a study done at UCLA in 2005 by a researcher named Tracy Mann and others called Medicare's Search for Effective Obesity Treatments. And they were looking at various diets to see which ones actually work and which ones work so well that Medicare should cover them. So they researched a lot of diets and they found that, for one, there's not a lot of good long-term data on diets, meaning that they don't really track people for much longer than a couple months at a time. And any diet can make you lose weight for a couple months at a time. But the important thing is, can the weight stay off? So I imagine that any of you who want to lose, let's say, 10 pounds, you don't really care if your 10 pounds are still off or gone 3 months from now. You might feel good, but you don't care if you lose 10 pounds 3 months from now if it's back a year from now, or if it's back plus another 5 pounds a year from now, right? I'm not making that bet. However, they found that 95% of people who go on diets regain all of their lost weight within 1 to 5 years. 95%, so nearly everyone. So if there's 45 people in this class, that means at best one of us would maintain our weight loss. And really it would even be less than one of us. And then they also found, staggeringly, that 66% of people, a full 2/3, gained more weight than they lost back. Gained more weight back than they lost. So let's say somebody lost 20 pounds over a couple months period. When their weight returned over the next couple of years, they gained more of it back. Maybe they gained 30 or 40 pounds back. Research also shows that dieting is the single biggest predictor of future weight gain. The more times you diet, the more more likely you are to be overweight or obese. And they even see this in what are called twin studies, where they compare two identical twins against one another because their DNA should be, identical, and so then all we can measure changes based on their environment and behaviors. And so they find when one twin diets and the other doesn't, the dieting twin ends up being heavier. And this increases in a dose response fashion, meaning that the more often the twin diets, the heavier they are likely to become. Whew! I don't know about you all, but this was mind-blowing to me after spending many years doing various kinds of diets and trying to control my weight through dieting. So let's look at some of the psychological factors and the physical or physiological factors that might underlie this. So I would love, actually, if you stopped the tape right now and took some notes on why do you think this happens? Based on your own dieting experience or that of people that you know, why do you think this weight gain returns, whatever? So for one, we see something called the Last Supper effect. Sometimes people call this the F-it effect, where you're going on a diet tomorrow, so you are going to eat everything you can get your hands on today. Or you get off the diet and then you eat everything you can get your hands on. So my best example of this is I have a friend who gives up sweets for Lent every year. And one year before Lent, I went to dinner with a couple friends. This friend was there. And he ate just a giant burger and fries, a huge milkshake, and then immediately went to this dessert place afterwards where you can get a giant donut with ice cream piled on top. And before he went to get this donut, he literally said he felt sick and didn't want it, but he knew this was his last chance. So if you can think back to your own experiences, many of you might have similar histories. I know certainly for me, at times when I really tried to restrict my sweet intake, for example, that I had a huge sweet tooth. And every time I did allow myself to eat something like brownies or ice cream, I would eat them until I felt sick. That you also have an increased preoccupation with food when you're dieting. So your brain becomes hyper focused on food. So with that brownie example, maybe if I hadn't let myself eat brownies for a while, every time they were in the room, it was the only thing I could think about, right? I couldn't think about the party I was at, the people I was talking to, what was going on in their lives, and how much I really cared about them. My brain kept diverting back to how many brownies are still on the table. Are there enough for me to have one? Is someone going to see me eat one? Etc., etc. So we have an increased preoccupation with food. We think about food more. And this is actually a biological response because when you're on a diet, your brain has no idea that there's a McDonald's on every other street corner. It simply thinks that you're starving. And so, in face of starvation, one of your body's brilliant responses is to cause you to think about food more. So if this was 1,000 years ago and you're in some hunter-gatherer tribe and food was pretty scarce, you hadn't eaten in a while, it would be advantageous to think about food a lot, right? To want to go and seek out and find food rather than like hanging out under some shade from a tree with your other hunter-gatherer friends. This can oftentimes lead to what's called a restrict binge cycle, whereby the longer you try to limit your food, your calorie intake, and the more you try to restrict, ultimately, this leads to what many reference as a binge or binging, which is eating large quantities of food in small, short periods of time, often accompanied by feelings of lack of control and a sense of numbness. And so sometimes people will get to the point where they've been dieting for a really long time, and then they'll just find themselves like standing over the kitchen counter, shoveling peanut butter into their mouth, or handfuls of cereal or cake or whatever. And then people beat themselves up and think, oh my gosh, I'm terrible, I can't be trusted around food. When in fact, this is another biological response to restriction. Your body can only starve, essentially, with food in plain sight for so long. And so it'll overeat when given the opportunity. And this is not a moral or personal failing. Rather, it is a sign that your body prefers to keep you alive. So some physiological factors, things happening inside your body. For one, we see a reduced resting metabolic rate. So we talked about in last lecture, the resting metabolic rate is the biggest amount of calories you burn in a day. It's the most calories that you burn in a day, maybe 60 to 80% of your total daily energy expenditure. So let's say, for example, yours is 1,300. And then you add on your activity and your movement and your digestion, et cetera, et cetera. When you diet or when you take in less food for a prolonged period of time, again, your body thinks, oh crap, I'm starving. And it starts to down-regulate your metabolism. So remember that your metabolism runs things like your heart rate and your temperature and the production of hormones and the building of bones and muscles and shiny new hair and nails and skin. And so your body will start to think, man, I really need 2,000 calories a day to get all this stuff done, but I've only been getting 1,500 for the last couple weeks. So there must be a famine happening. I should probably burn fewer calories just to keep myself safe. So now your body's going to start gradually bumping things down. Your temperature might drop, your recovery might drop, your immune system function might drop, your hair, skin, and nails might get dry, you might not produce as many hormones. And this can be sort of subclinical or unnoticeable for many, but over time, or if the restriction is severe, people will have very severe consequences where they'll have such low blood pressure and heart rate that they'll get dizzy or have heart arrhythmias. People will start to lose quantities of hair. Women might lose their menstrual cycle. Both sexes might lose muscle mass or bone density, or if it gets so severe, even organ tissue. Pretty much every body system will be affected. But from a real simple level, this also means that you're just burning fewer calories per day, even if it's not severe. And the scary thing that we see is that sometimes this does not pick back up when we start eating again. So there was a big study done on The Biggest Loser 6 years after the end of a competition, looking at what happened to people's weight and muscle mass and resting metabolic rate. They found immediately after the competition that, as expected, RMR, weight, and muscle mass went down. They found, however, that at 6 years, the contestants had gained back 75% of their weight, but they hadn't gained back all their muscle tissue, and their resting metabolic rate actually was a little bit lower even than right after the competition. So it did not rebound as they started eating more, which gives us the idea that the body sort of remembered that caloric restriction and danger and was still trying to protect itself. We don't see this in every study. Sometimes it can increase, especially if a person feeds themselves consistently and regularly. The body starts to trust again, and metabolism can pick back up. We also see reduced muscle mass. So as you're dieting to lose weight, unfortunately, some of the weight that is lost will come from your muscle tissue and not just your fat. And this is a big bummer for us because muscle is expensive tissue. It costs a lot of calories to maintain. Fat costs nearly nothing. So if we lose muscle, now we just burn fewer calories per day at rest, and we're less functional. And we like our muscle, I think. So oftentimes then when people gain their weight back, this 66% or more, most of that is in the form of fat. And it's always more in the form of fat in the beginning. Only if people continue to feed themselves well and engage in some exercise resistance training does the muscle start to come back. We see altered hunger and fullness hormones. So leptin is a hormone that tells us we are full. Ghrelin is a hormone that tells us we are hungry. And ghrelin kind of sounds like gremlin to me. So I think of like a little hunger monster, like a gremlin. Anyways, this alteration will mean that we produce less leptin and are less sensitive to it, so we won't feel full as easily, and we produce much more ghrelin, meaning we're hungry, hungry, hungry. So maybe if you've dieted or underate for a while and then you eat a full meal, you might just feel like a bottomless pit. You can't get to the bottom of it. And then we have this thing called fat overshooting, which is a real big bummer. So this is a graph from an experiment done in the 1940s called the Minnesota Starvation Experiment. And briefly, it was an experiment done to determine as we were, as World War II was ending and we were liberating concentration camps, how we could safely refeed people who were starving. So this group of healthy college-age men went on essentially a starvation diet where they cut their total daily calorie intake in half. And they watched what happened then, and then they tried to refeed them, and they watched what happened. So some of the things we saw is that the men essentially exhibited behaviors that are very common of extreme dieters. So they were obsessed with food. Many of them collected cookbooks, some of them over 100, and this was before the days of Instagram, mind you, so they couldn't just like food pages or blogs. Many of them dreamed about becoming chefs. Some of them stole food. Some of them binged and then later threw up. Some of them went into depression or even psychoses. Many of them felt socially isolated, sexually withdrawn, and as we would expect, they lost quite a great deal of body weight. But the really interesting piece is what happened afterwards. So they refed them up to 10,000 calories a day. Not at the beginning, though. It was much smaller at first. And if you look at this graph, the dark circles are just body weight, including everything that is in the body, and the open circles are body fat. So you see that as the experiment goes on, up until R20 they're losing both body weight and body fat, dropping tremendously. As they start to gain, R24, as they start to gain the weight back, their weight gradually climbs, their fat mass shoots way over. So this shows that of the weight that they gained back, much more of it was fat than things like muscle or lean tissue they might have lost. Now you might wonder, why the hell would the body do that? And the answer is protection, right? If you've just scared your body into thinking that food is very scarce and you start eating again, it's going to think, man, I should hold on to as much extra food on my body as possible. So it's going to store a bunch of extra fat originally. So this is challenging for many dieters because as they start to eat more, they have increased hunger, they have a lower resting metabolic rate, they have a preoccupation with food, and their body has a propensity for storing fat. Ugh, sucks, right? So what many people do is they jump right back into the next diet in this thing called yo-yo dieting, which is very dangerous for health. When, as you'll see here, if the people were just to continue eating normally, meeting their hunger needs, their weight would plateau and their fat mass would start to drop back down to baseline levels as their muscle mass and organ tissue and other things increased, which says to us that the body gets more comfortable over time, right? So if you have dieted before, if you've dieted recently, if you're dieting now, I implore you to follow some of our healthy nutrition practices from the last lecture and from the next one that we have. Engage in regular exercise and just kind of see what your body does over time. Give it some time. And this can take a year or more, but give it some time and it will get there. So what do we do? Right? We just talked about mindless eating. We talked about our tricky eating environment. We talked about the futility of dieting. So you might be scratching your head like, okay, Kelsey, I get it. What would you have me do? My answer is mindful eating. So mindful eating is just, mindfulness itself is being mindful of and paying attention to one's experience without judgment. And we can apply that to the eating experience. So this means paying attention to everything about eating without judgment, like this food is bad or I'm bad for eating this. So this typically involves getting away from distractions like the TV or your phone, setting aside time to eat, and focusing on the following things. Hunger and fullness cues. I'm going to give you some specifics for how to do this in a minute. How can you determine when you are hungry and when you are full and when you should thus start eating and stop eating? Being mindful of food preferences, as in what foods do you actually feel like eating that will be nourishing both to your taste buds and to your body. Eating sensations, so the tastes, textures, temperatures, smells, sounds of eating. And finally, the thoughts and feelings involved in your eating experience. So, some things to consider. There's no right or wrong way to eat. Mindful eating is where you aim to select foods that are satisfying and nourishing, meaning that taste good and meet your taste preferences, but also make your body feel good and not crummy afterwards. And a reminder that it's a practice, not an outcome. So it's a continual evolution of doing. Some of the benefits we see. Well, people eat less. When you pay attention to your food, you will eat less of it because you'll be full and satisfied sooner. We absorb more nutrients because more blood flow is going to our gut. We see reduced eating disorder behavior. We see reduced binging and emotional eating, which we talked about as a big issue for many of us. We see globally improved self-esteem, self-efficacy, which means feelings of confidence around eating, change in food preferences towards healthier food over time, and ultimately for some who were overeating due to mindlessness before, weight loss. So some strategies to use. I said you want to aim to eat when you're hungry and stop when you're full. Well, many of us are like, oh, how do I know? So this is the hunger scale of hunger and fullness from 1 to 10. Think of it like a gas tank where 1 is empty, running on fumes, 10 is totally full, 5 is right there in the middle. So in terms of hunger, 1 would be absolutely starving, famished. You'll eat anything that's put in front of your face. 5 would be neutral. You're neither hungry nor full. And 10 would be like post-Thanksgiving stuff. You feel just sick. So those 1 and 10 are not places we want to get to. 3 is a good place to aim to start. This means you're pretty hungry, but you're not overwhelmingly hungry. So you might have some hunger sensations that we'll talk about in the next slide, but you don't feel like you would eat anything anyone put in front of your face. And you want to aim to stop around a 7, which means that you're comfortably full, but your belly doesn't hurt and you don't feel tired and you don't have the need to take a nap. What happens when you get to a 2 or especially a 1 is that you become overly hungry. You're famished, which means that you'll make poor eating decisions and you'll reach for foods that are higher in quick digesting calories like sugar and foods that will just give you quick calories or a lot of calories in general. And it'll often take you a lot longer to feel full, so you'll rebound potentially to an 8 or to a 9. So today I went to the grocery store and I had exercised before and I was kind of hungry, but I didn't stop to eat. And I came home from the store and I was really hungry. I was maybe at a 2. And I ate what felt like a comfortable amount. And it's probably been 4 hours since then, but I'm still kind of like up here. I ate too much. I ate too much food because I was overly hungry. And now I'm not beating myself up for that. That's a thing that happens to me sometimes. It's a thing that happens to humans sometimes. But for the most part, I like to eat around here because it feels comfortable and I don't feel frantic, and I like to stop around here, and that's what feels comfortable. So I spent a lot of years waiting until I got down here, and this is a common habit of many dieters because they think, I want to eat as little food as possible, so I should wait to eat, wait to eat, wait to eat. And then they get here and they're like, oh man, I really want ice cream. And they eat a lot until they get here, right? This is normal. Don't feel bad if you do this, but start tuning in. So how can you tune in? Triangle pause of awareness. This can be used for any kind of mindfulness, but we're going to use it for hunger and fullness. So it asks you to pay attention to your thoughts, your feelings, and your physical sensation. So what thoughts might prompt you to know that you're hungry? Well, you might start thinking about food, or you might start thinking about what you want to eat, or you might start thinking less clearly. Physical sensations. For many people, it might be a growling or an empty stomach, though not everybody gets that. It might be a tiredness or a dizziness. That could be if you're really hungry. Or if you're really hungry, like a shakiness. Those are not places we want to get to. And then feelings, you might start to feel anxious or irritable. People often call this hangry, where you're so hungry that you're angry, right? So some of those are more extreme, closer to like a 1 or 2 type of hunger. But start paying attention to these 3 things to determine when you're around a 3 level of hunger. We can use this triangle pause similarly for fullness. So as you're eating, you might notice sensations of fullness in your thoughts, in that you stop thinking about food, or you start thinking about the next thing. You might notice physical sensations like a lack of that empty feeling, or kind of people describe it as like a general comfort in their stomach or in their whole body, and feelings of like calmness or happiness or contentment. Whereas if you overeat, you might have feelings of pain in your stomach and emotional feelings of guilt or sleepiness. So you can use this triangle pause to determine where you are on the hunger scale from 1 to 10 and when is an appropriate time to eat and stop eating. And this isn't like a slam dunk one time and you've got it figured out forever. This is a place for continual practice and effort. But if you follow it over time, you'll start to reconnect with your innate ability to know how much food you need and meet those needs without under or over meeting them. And then one additional thing is to find satisfaction in your food. So food is meant to be enjoyable and pleasurable. And we often overlook this, especially in the US, where we're constantly talking about the nutritional qualities of our food. We forget that it's supposed to be yummy and delicious, and that we're designed to like food because that keeps us alive. And in fact, we see in Japan, in their national eating guidelines, that this is a tenet of healthy eating, that food should be enjoyed. So the satisfaction of food involves enjoying, using your 5 senses. So enjoying the tastes, the textures, the smells, the aromas of your food while you're eating. And we find that when people do, they are naturally satisfied with less and eat smaller portions. So we see this play out sometimes in the French paradox. And the French paradox says that It makes no sense because people in France and many other countries eat foods that we would consider unhealthy here, like rich cheeses, full-fat cheeses, breads and croissants, wine, oh my, and yet they are generally much healthier than we are here in the US. And one of the potential theories for this is that they have an innate enjoyment and guilt-freeness in eating. They eat much more slowly and socially, and so they ultimately just eat how much food their body needs, and thus are healthier, even if they're not eating all the copious amounts of fruits and veggies that we are trying to get on our plates here in the US. So here are some resources for you. Eatingmindfully.com is a resource by psychologist Susan Albers, who focuses on mindful eating. Headspace is just a general app to practice mindfulness, doesn't have to be related to eating. The Slow Down Diet is a fantastic, easy to read book on eating, mindfully eating, and gives you great week by week prompts and strategies to do this. Oh, I cannot recommend it highly enough. And then Intuitive Eating, a revolutionary program that works, is a program by 2 dietitians that talks about mindful eating and this concept of intuitive eating, which helps teach you how to listen to your internal body cues to determine what, when, and how much to eat. And then some additional strategies for mindful eating. Get rid of your distractions. So turn the TV off, put the phone away, etc. Sometimes setting a timer can help for like 15 or 20 minutes and aiming to take that whole time. So that can help slow us down. Creating an ideal eating environment can help. So eating in like a cluttered office or with stuff all over your table at home or on the couch doesn't set us up to eat mindfully. Start small. You can do 1 snack a day or even 1 snack a week and build from there. Some people practice by eating with their non-dominant hand, which slows you down. It's always useful to find a partner with any health plan you want to undertake. Portioning out your food beforehand can be quite helpful in eating less. Taking time to breathe before and during a meal will help slow you down. Even just taking a few deep breaths first will trigger your parasympathetic nervous system, send more blood to your digestive system, and help you literally, from like a physical standpoint, chill out. And just remember that it's a process. Don't turn this into a new diet to beat yourself up over. It's a continual learning process. I've been doing this for 5 years and I still learn about it all the time. And some days are better than others, and that's okay. So things to consider for yourself. When do you eat mindlessly? What distracts you? What do you notice about your eating when you do eat mindlessly? How does your food environment impact your eating choices? Have you ever dieted? If so, what were some of the mental, emotional, and physical outcomes? Did you keep that weight off forever? And finally, what would you like for your relationship with food and your body moving forward? What do you want that to look like and be? So that is it for today. I hope you enjoyed this section. Please reach out if you have additional questions, comments, or want to learn more about any of these topics. We have one more nutrition topic that we'll cover next week, which is practical strategies, and we will go over your nutrition assignment, where you'll practice both nutrition tracking and mindful eating separately and compare and contrast the two. Thanks all. Have a lovely day.